Today, we're going to learn how to UV map anything in Maya in 5 simple steps. My last video was in Maya 2020 about 4 years ago, so it's time for an update. I'm also going to answer a lot of the questions that came up from that video in this one, so make sure to stick around to the end. So let's jump right into it. Now, before we get into the 5 simple steps, we first need to understand what is UV mapping. UV mapping is the process of taking a 3D object and converting it to a 2D coordinate system. You're going from X, Y, Z to U and V. One of the best examples I can give is just look at clothing. Clothing has natural seams from the stitching and sewing. So that's a great place to start when you're first understanding how to do UV mapping. Then look at the real world. See what's on your desk. For example, I have this can here, and you can see the label that goes all the way around the can. And then on the back, there's a natural seam there that is used to print and stamp the can. The top and bottom are cut off from the label, so those will be places that will add seams. So with that in mind, let's get into the actual 5-step process. So here we are in Maya, and the first step is going to be deleting history and freezing transforms. So select all of your objects that you'll be UV mapping, and then select the parent object, and just go to freeze transformation and delete history. That makes sure that there's no weird history or transforms being applied to the UVs as we unwrap them. Then we can head over to the workspace and go to UV editing. Now we can go to step 2, which is generating UVs. Now, if you select all of your models, you're going to see a complete mess of UVs. Now, if this bothers you, the first thing you can do is just go to edit and delete. There, no problem. The next thing we do is, before you actually UV map, you need to generate UVs. So let's start with this more cube-like object, and then we're going to increase the complexity as we go. So with this object selected, I'm going to press Ctrl+1 to isolate. Then in our UV editor, now by the way, if you don't see this, you can see that I can just go over to the left tab and find UV toolkit there. Then I want to go to Create, Camera Based. Now this is going to generate UVs based off the camera position, which is exactly what we want. Then I can hold right click and go into edge mode, which is step 3, selecting and cutting your seams. Since we have a fundamental understanding of where to naturally place our UV seams, it's just a matter of selecting those seams and cutting. So we can see if we go in now, and if we have a nice sub D model with clean edge flow, we can just double click our edges here on the corner, and this will take us all the way to the top. If this was capped off, I'd make sure to cut around and delete that cap, but for now I can just simply select the edge loop that's on the corner. Then I can hold shift and double click the seam on the other side. And then I want to also separate this kind of screw hole here. So holding shift will continue to add to our selection. So I've selected all of the edges, and I want to actually cut the UVs. So you can see now we go from create, now we're going to go to cut. And with our edges still selected, I'm going to select cut. And you can see what happens here is that the UV border now is highlighted white. And in here, you can see that they're kind of bold now. They're a little bit thicker than the rest. So that brings us to our next step, step 4, which is unfold. So you can go back to UV mode by holding right click and going to UV, selecting all of the UVs. Let's zoom out here a little bit, and then doing a simple unfold. So you can expand unfold down here, hit unfold, and boom, there you go. And that brings us to our last step, which is just kind of organizing our UV layout. So if we go all the way to the bottom, you can see arrange and layout. And the two that I use all the time is orient shells and layout. Orient just makes sure that it kind of lays it parallel with the U and V axes. Then, once everything is laid out, we want to verify that our UVs look okay. So if I go into this checkerboard mode, you can see that I have all of these grids, and the goal here is to make sure that these UV checkers are perfectly, or as close to perfect, to being square. So there you go. We can see that we have nice, clean, square-like checkers all the way around this model. So if I exit checker map mode, we can recap the 5 steps, which is deleting history and freezing transforms, creating and generating UVs with camera-based projection, selecting and cutting the seams, unfolding, and organizing and laying out your UVs. So let's apply that to a couple more objects and see how it continues to work on any object. So now I'll go back to object mode, I'll hit Ctrl+1 to exit isolation mode, and let's go on. Quick interruption. If you've clicked on this video, you're probably interested in 3D modeling and topology. So I'm excited to announce that I'm putting together a 3D modeling topology masterclass. Whether you're a beginner or an advanced user, this is going to help improve your skills in 3D modeling. This is just the first course, and trust me, you're in good hands. I'm an industry professional and I've been teaching for over 15 years. And I have some of the most popular topology videos on my YouTube. And this is going to be one of the first of many courses on my platform. I will be covering the entire 3D art pipeline, starting with modeling all the way through rendering for both offline and real-time rendering. So stay tuned and be sure to check out my Patreon for early access information. So I'll see you there. Let's go on to the grip of this object. With this grip selected, we already have the history and transforms frozen. So we can go to just create camera-based UVs. We want to now select our edges. So hold shift to add to that edge selection. And in this case, it's a pretty good example, but if you had to manually select and add to your selections, just continue to hold shift while you select. And I can just kind of manually add to selection, holding shift that way. So there's always different ways to add to your selection. And you can see, I can do that probably here on this other side. And you can double click to add to that selection. And with that, I can cut those UVs, go to UV mode, select, and unfold, orient, layout, and boom. It's very, very simple. Now, we want to check something, which is going to be our checkers. And what we notice here now is we start to get what's called distortion. And if I go back to my editor, so UV editor, so make sure you're there and hit 7 on your keyboard, we can see that distortion coming in. Now, really the only way to remove and eliminate distortion is by adding more UV seams. So if I press 7 on the keyboard here to get out of distortion view, I want to add a seam right on the corner. So let's exit checker mode so we can see a little bit more clearly. And guess what? I'm just going to continue this edge here, and we can hold shift right click in the editor mode. So you can of course use the menu, but I like to use the marking menu. So holding shift right mouse button will give you cut. And then I can go into UV mode, select everything, and shift right mouse button, unfold, and then unfold. Now let's look at the UVs. The checkers look good, but we have a seam there. And if I go into distortion mode, the distortion is gone. So now let's apply that to one more object, and then we'll talk about why UV seams aren't an issue. So exit distortion, exit checker map mode, and let's grab the canister here, the main canister. So I'll select that, hit Control 1, and with this object selected, run through the same process. We will do camera based, we'll select our edges. So I'll speed through this. And just like the can example, I want to make sure to cut off the tops and add an underlying seam that runs the length of the model. So now we're back in UV editor. We're going to hold shift right mouse button, cut, go into UV mode, select everything, shift right mouse button, unfold. You can see it's very fast. But like I said before, there's now distortion here. So how to minimize that distortion? If I orient my shells and lay it out, let's look at our checker. We can see at first glance it looks okay, but if I start to get here towards the ends, we can see that there's that tension that's pulling on these UVs. So we start big and we're getting really small and stretched here. So again, we're gonna apply that workflow of just simply adding more seams. We can just select this edge that runs the middle length of the model, and we can see I don't wanna split the cap, right? But I'll show you a quick way is that if I just quickly select these, I can go back into the UV editor and just marquee select with control. So holding control, I'm deselecting the edges, okay? And I've cut this, which is great. Now I can cut, right? So again, let's look at our checkers. We can see the distortion, and we can see actually in distortion view, a lot of red and a lot of blue. But if I now go and press 7 again, and let's look at this area. This is the problem area, right? I've added those seams to hopefully remove the tension. Well, unfold and let's see what happens. Boom. We get those nice even squares, which is exactly what we want. So we have that. And if you need to continue, I mean, there's nothing stopping you from adding another seam here at the top to help relieve that tension here again, just so you can see it a little more clearly. You can cut that and unwrap it. So if you want to split it into even 4s, and we go back to checker view and then unfold and then lay it out again. Now again, you may be wondering is like, what the heck? Why are we adding a seam in the dead center of this model where it's most easily viewed? The good news is it's not that big of a deal because you can paint over the seam directly in your 3D painting software like Substance Painter. And 2, if you have more repeating or procedural materials and textures, well, you can use a method called triplanar blending that'll get rid of those seams instead of using the UV projection. Now, we're almost there. There's one more part that came up in my last video where people were asking about, well, what happens when you have objects that unfold but unfold with curvature? So if I select maybe this vent port here at the end, hit Control 1. So I'm going to speed through the process and unwrap this. There, and I just applied the unfold. Now you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. You get this kind of curved UV projection here. So if I orient and then lay out, we can see that our grid, it looks okay, but maybe we want it to be nice and straight and nice and even. And on top of that, having it like this semicircle is going to take up a lot more UV space, which we don't want. And having it laid out flat is actually going to make it a lot easier. Now for this example, you can see that I have kind of the inside of this object, and if you already have it to this state, you can simply unfold along the U, and then unfold along the V, and then do a straighten UVs. And then boom, it straightens out the UVs. But if we try to do that here, you can see what happens. I can unfold along V, U, straight, and it just has a hard time with it. So we need to help the UV mapping algorithm. So in order to do that, what we can do is go into face mode, select these faces like so, and then specifically only apply a cylindrical projection just to this. So now let's go to the top, and instead of using camera base, we'll use cylindrical. Now we have this gizmo here that's a cylinder projection. I can hit this red T at the bottom. You can see we can kind of change it, but I don't want to change the starting and end. What I want to change is the orientation. So hit T for transform, and you can see we get our typical transform gizmo. You can see this blue circle, that's your rotation tool. So if I select that rotation tool and go into rotation and hold J while I'm rotating, it'll snap. And there you go, it completely UV maps it nice and even with a cylindrical projection. So now if I check my UVs, you can see it's starting to look a lot better, but we're getting a little bit of that skewing. That's where unfold along U and V come in. So let's unfold along U. Boom, look at that. It kind of cleans that up because it's unfolding it specifically only along the U axes. Then I can unfold along V. Boom. Starts to even that up. And if we need it, we can straighten these UVs. And there we go. It looks really good. And if I disable checker mode, we can see the UVs are nice and perfectly straight. Selecting everything, we can orient, layout, check our checker again, double check our distortion, and we can see a little bit of blue and a little bit of red, and that's completely fine. So sometimes you gotta pick your poison if you want a little bit of distortion, or minimizing distortion by laying it not straight. But I'll tell you right now, this is gonna have no issues texturing in the texturing software. This is the workflow that I use to UV map pretty much any object. This gets me about 90 to 95% there, and then the rest is using more specific workflows. But don't worry, because I'm going to take those specific workflows and a bunch of tips from all of my mastering UVs and condense it down to a much shorter video for everybody to help everyone really get over the issues of UV mapping. Because I'll tell you, after all these years of doing it, it gets easier every time. Now, if you'd like access to this source file, be sure to check out my Patreon. And I've gotten a lot of questions in the comments about a Discord. I've had a Discord for a good time now. That was invite only, but I'm getting ready to open it up to the public. We have a few hundred really eager and talented artists in there. So if you'd like to jump in and ask questions and help other artists out, be sure to join down below. It's a great growing community. And then check out the Patreon for the rest of the benefits. So with that, I'll see you around.